Hello, friends, and welcome. We are here today to talk about Truth of Crowns, Book One of the Ash Eternal. And excuse my voice, I have a cold, so we are powering through, but we are here with Varsha and the author, Carl D. Albert, our friend Carl D. Albert. Excited to get to it. So we will be discussing lots of non-spoilery things, and then when we get to the spoilery portion at the end, we'll be sure to let everybody know. So if you haven't read the book, you do not want to be spoiled on this book. Let me tell you, you do not want to ruin the experience for yourself. But if you're one of those weirdos who enjoy being spoiled, then I guess that's on you. But Varsha, will you start
Are
us
you
off with an
calling me out,
introduction?
Steve?
No, not, well, there's a few weirdos out there, but yeah.
Hi, I'm Varsha. I run the YouTube channel Reading by the Rainy Mountain. And this is the second or third author interview I got to participate in. Yeah, Carl's become a good friend over the course of the last few months as we've talked about The Prince of Nothing, and I was excited to read his book. I enjoyed it very much, so I'm glad to get to talk about it today.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. My dad and sister, to different degrees, are the types of weirdos who like to have stuff spoiled. Like they'll read the summaries before they go see movies and stuff. And I have never understand it. I'm like, it doesn't necessarily ruin the experience for me, but it is something that I avoid. I would say I like a surprise. I like when a story surprises me, takes me aback a little. And I mean, that's definitely something I was trying to achieve with Truth of Crowns is I want it to be unpredictable in some sense, even though I do open up in very old timey Romeo and Juliet fashion and tell you that a major character is going to die. And I guess I'll be vague to start, but chapter 1, there's an epigraph where I tell you this is happening and the shit's going to hit the fan.
Yeah, well, I guess I want to get into all that. I guess to start with is where did the idea for this book start? What was the spark that started this process?
So I am pretty open about the fact that the earliest idea really was kind of embarrassingly, what if Game of Thrones but in the Renaissance? And really it was just I at the time I wanted to tell a political epic fantasy, something dark, something that was like a family drama, but that maybe was had an environment, a world that wasn't quite like what I was expecting. Now, of course, there actually is a lot of Renaissance fantasy out there. Lies of Locke Lamore is a really popular, famous one. I don't know if we have a pseudo equivalent of Game of Thrones, but in the Renaissance exactly. But there is a lot of Renaissance epic fantasy, which I didn't know when I started writing this book. So that was the initial seed, and then it evolved a lot. The tale grew in the telling, you could say, and I brought in kind of semi-autobiographical elements for to help kind of give the book a point of view and a structure in certain senses. The Greys, who in many ways are kind of the main family, their immediate family structure is structured just like my immediate nuclear family. And I didn't do that to write versions of my family members or myself per se, but because it kind of gave me again a structure to work off of and helped ideate for characters. And so that was something. And then beyond that, I also, one of the earliest ideas was I wanted to write a fantasy murder mystery. And actually in the earliest versions, we got to the murder that happens now about halfway. It's the midpoint of the story. We got to it much earlier, and it was kind of the driving factor. And I just kept building out what at the time wasn't like a prologue chapter, but was sort of as the introduction. Because I just kept building out these characters and the political dynamics, and because that was the stuff that I was even more attracted to than the murder mystery itself, which is I viewed as sort of a dramatic way in to the political machinations. And of course, I realized too after I was doing that that that's also what Game of Thrones does with the death of John Arryn. And so I was like, okay, well, how do I make this different? Luckily, my death is very different. I was very conscious in the writing that I didn't want this to just read like Game of Thrones fanfic, you know? Um, and I think in actually in some respects, um, I maybe veered too far for a long time. Like there weren't, I won't spoil exactly how, but there weren't dragons in the book for a long time, and because I didn't want to, jump on George Martin's back. Which hysterically, a little anecdote is he also didn't have dragons in Game of Thrones for a long time
Mm.
until one of his friends, Melinda Snodgrass, I believe, told him he needed to put dragons in it. And so you got the Targaryens and everything. I mean, the Targaryens were already in it, but they went from just like, oh, Daenerys is this, poor exiled princess to like the mother of dragons, right? So that's a little factoid for you. And I kind of similarly decided that this mysterious um, figure, fantastical figure who I knew was not human, um, was something more draconic, we'll say, and I'll leave it at that. And yeah, just generally the story kind of changed a lot as with each draft. As I grew as an adult, I started writing this while I was still in college. I did the bulk of the writing right after I graduated during COVID, and then it changed in notable ways when well, after two things. One, when I realized this was kind of a Shakespearean tragedy, a classical tragedy. I'd been struggling to kind of find the structure for the story. And so I thought, I realized ultimately that this whole thing was building up to a big death and to a lot of people dying. And um, I wanted to, rather than maybe trying to like hide from that, um, to like hang a lamp on it and really make that a point and make that the thematic core in many ways of the story and certainly the structural core. And beyond that, then when I got AP Canavan on board as my developmental editor, who, for those who don't know, AP Canavan is one of the beta readers, one of the and friends of Stephen Erickson and Ian Esselmont, who wrote in the Malazan books. And I hired him, and he was a great help. We hit it off, and he gave me some really, really helpful notes that helped kind of reshape the story finally into its final form. Massage out some arcs, actually removed one whole subplot, um, and really encouraged me to actually he through his notes got me into a position where I ended up killing at the very end of the book a character who had survived every other draft up until that point and who I had plans for several books. But I decided, without spoiling, I mean, it's the last character who dies in the story, in this book, that is. And basically, because of the rewrites, things changed. And so I guess
Mm.
what I'm getting at the core of all this is the story changed a lot over many years and a lot of different influences. And as I grew and changed as a writer and as a person, and my influences grew and changed, beyond just like initially it was like Game of Thrones and like Aragon and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter were kind of a lot of the things I was reaching to. And then Dune joined it and Shakespeare and Malazan and The First Law and Robin Hobb, who's now my favorite fantasy author, maybe my favorite author, period. I got a lot of different influences that really helped. I think um, it colored the story in different ways.
Can definitely feel the Shakespearean references in this one. Definitely.
Yeah. I'm not very well versed in Shakespeare. I have a high level. Okay, so my acquaintance with Shakespeare is twofold. One, we read the heck out of Julius Caesar because we had to study that for school, and I read that, I don't know, over 3 years or something. It was ridiculous, and and then I had this abridged English, like normal English summarized versions of the stories for everything else. I read Romeo and Juliet, Taming of the Shrew, and a few others. So that's my acquaintance with Shakespeare. I can see I don't know about the language and the way the story is structured and things like that, but the highlights, the plot points, I guess I do see some similarities. That's pretty interesting.
It
And
definitely it just to like bounce off that very quickly. It definitely, as I said, like when I decided I wanted to hang a lantern on it, I very much then was like, okay, so I'm going to make these specific things even more obviously not to
mm,
Shakespeare. And like, and there are turns of phrase. I have specific passages where I'm, if not literally like quoting or even misquoting Shakespeare, I am like using some of his language to evoke a specific idea. And thematically, the story was always in it was always a Shakespearean tragedy and sort of in that vein, in a response to his plays, you could say. But I didn't know that for years and years, and it was only late into the writing that I would realize, oh, this is really what this story is and what it's about. You know, like a lot of Shakespeare's plays are about the Great Chain of Being, which comes up and is a real historical thing. And I first learned about it at like the age of 16, about kind of the divine order of things. You kings on top, right? Peasants on bottom. You mix it up with like knights, clergy, so and like yeomen, all up through the middle, and bugs and monster or not monsters, but monsters are in there too. But animals, on down. It's just this whole like hierarchy of the universe that is divinely mandated, and it was this core notion of the divine right of kings. And you have so much fantasy that is really um, takes that at face value. Tolkien, I think, very obviously does. And certainly my story isn't the only fantasy story out there that one kind of challenges the divine right of kings, and that like, oh, all it takes is a good king to like make a good society. But that was something I wanted to directly tackle and confront, and do it through that medieval mindset, as opposed to just like, like the first law, for example, I think does it, but in a much more postmodern way.
Hmm.
hmm. So about the Shakespearean references, like I think one of the things that I feel when I think about any Shakespeare story, like it feels very, this sounds bad, but I don't know how else to describe it, but like over the top. I don't mean it in a bad way, but just like these larger than life characters and larger than life things that happen to them. How did you try to balance that with, a more modern approach to storytelling, like things that's, supposed to be subtle, and you're supposed to trust the reader to figure out what's happening. Did How do you find the balance between those two approaches to style?
That's a really great question, and I'm actually really happy you brought it up. Shakespeare wrote melodramas, and because we think of Shakespeare as this like high art, people don't talk about it. But he wrote the equivalent of like soap operas, right?
Mm.
And I think I personally, as a writer, gravitate towards that sort of level of high drama. And I don't mean high as like, it's larger than life, right? Like it's raised up, and so that was something that I always knew I was just naturally gonna, write. Like I grew up, superheroes were a big inspiration for me growing up, and
Hmm.
I had briefly a vigilante plot line in this one of the early drafts that like I ended up cutting because I was like, this is shit. But like, I there again, it's changed so much. Yes. The simple answer to your question, Varsha, is yes. That was something I wanted to actively balance because, we don't tell stories like I'm not going to have someone die of heartbreak, you know, uh,
Mm.
which is something that like happens in Shakespeare plays. I There's nothing wrong, with that. Tolkien does it too, and George Lucas did it in the prequels of Star Wars. And that's fine. And I think I do want to evoke kind of larger than life characters and high emotions and a lot of mess, kind of the soapy mess of where things get, you have weird romantic and family relations, and everything is very dramatic, and everyone's, often your heroes are very tortured, that sort of thing. That's something I was very interested in, but I did want to ground it a bit more with a level of psychological realism that I think you are more expected to have in this day and age, particularly if you're writing um, a more thematic, more like literary type of fantasy, which I was striving to do. You know, I want to write a book that says something. I want it to be entertaining, like bottom line. You know, that's the number one thing, because like anything, you know, I want to sell books. I want people to have fun reading my books. Um, but I do have things to say, and there are things I want to explore about the human condition. And so I think to get away with that now, you definitely. I mean, one thing to mention about Shakespeare too is, right, he was writing for like the stage, which is very different. I mean, if you go see plays today, musicals even more so than, you know, maybe traditional dramas, they're larger than life. I mean, the characters sing out loud their feelings, right? It's very out there, and I love it. And I actually find there's no medium that I find more moving, that can move me more easily to tears than musicals. I love it. But you know, a book is very different, and I think a book does require a subtler touch. So, in short, yes.
This is this book is one of the few that's had me set it down and like take a minute for some of the things that's saying something for the things that I read. So
Yeah.
definitely that's a tragedy, but just some oh, just some heartbreaking moments. And a lot of, I was surprised how, I shouldn't say surprised, but I was impressed with how you handled some of the romance and how you handled some of those feelings. And it seemed it was very touching, the feelings and the things that the characters went through. But really quickly, I wanted to ask you about AP and his feedback. Uh, well, first, I guess, why did you reach out to AP specifically? And when when he gave you feedback, what were some of the things that you wouldn't have thought of on your own had he not given you back or provided for you, I should say?
Um, so the first was why did I reach out to him? I When I knew I wanted to self-publish, I knew I wanted to get an editor because I wanted my book to be of quality equivalent to the ones that are published traditionally. I have a level of pride. It's something that I feel like that's necessary for me to do. I don't want to put out a book that I feel is substandard. Um, and so I need an editor. I believe very much in the process of getting and giving notes. That's what I was trained on in film school. In Hollywood, you have to be able to. Yeah, for people who don't know, I work in entertainment. I'm pursuing a career as a screenwriter, and I went to a film school, a very intense film school, um, where I learned a lot about writing and I learned a lot about screenwriting, and I got very used to getting criticized. And my scripts were always better after getting those notes. And you know, you learn which notes to take too, right? Because some notes aren't right, or some notes, you know, what they're saying is wrong, but they're touching on something they just don't know. They're not quite correct about what the thing is that they're criticizing, or what the solution is. And an editor is great for that, right? They're professionally trained to give notes, essentially. And AP is someone who I'd been following his channel for a while, well before I knew he was an editor. I just liked his YouTube channel. I thought he was really smart. He thought about stories in a similar way that I do. And that's a hard thing to come by, to be honest. I think because of his academic background, and because, you know, he knows a lot about kind of the theories of storytelling and narrative structure and things like that. And you know, the struggle of like trying to balance the you know, what is subjective versus what's objective in a critique, and like, you know, and this is an endless dialogue. It's never going to end. Um, and on top of all that, like, he's a fantasy nerd, and he knows his fantasy, and he's worked on fantasy. He worked on Malazan, and I was reading Malazan, and that was a big part of why I was watching his channel, and I was loving it. And then I happened to, I was also following Philip Chase, and I found out Philip was going to be self-publishing, and he'd worked with AP and had nothing but positive things to say, which didn't surprise me. And I had always loved their dynamic too, as nemesis. Is it nemesis or nemesises? Nemesis, I'd imagine. It's Greek, right?
First one
Anyway,
is right. No, I'm kidding. Nemesis. Like you call them
nemesis.
this.
Um, yeah, no, and so that kind of opened my eyes to the possibility, and I reached out to AP. We did sort of a trial period where he read my prologue, and it was basically a test to see, one, does he like my writing enough to work on it? Like, is this something he feels like he can meaningfully contribute to? And two, do I like his notes well enough and how he analyzes and provides edits? And thankfully we did. It worked out. And I expected it to, again, just because I felt like I'd followed his channel long enough to have a feel for who he was and his taste. And yeah, when we got to finally editing the full book, I mean, there was so much. There were like little things that have big payoffs, just in terms of the actual like word choices and the style of prose, that I wouldn't have noticed because I just wasn't trained in that way. And having him point it out to me helped me grow in that way that I really appreciated as a writer. Um, there were absolutely plot elements. He helped me kind of the structure. It was really messy. The draft he read, it had been, I think, for several drafts. It was just kind of meandering. I think the pacing was all over the place. I always knew the book was kind of going to be a slow burn until about the halfway point, but it just wasn't. I don't think it was in the right place yet. And he helped me find how to pull things around, how to move things around. Um, he. This is not a spoiler, but we, in the previous version, start with Loria, who's one of the POV characters. She is like chapter 2, I think, and she's not actually introduced until chapter 7, and not given a POV until chapter 9 now, which is in Act 2 of the book. And that was something where I was essentially starting with like multiple storylines going on. And AP helped me realize, to kind of go back to the Tolkien approach, right? Of like being more focused to start out, right? And, you start in the Shire with these hobbits, and, you have Gandalf come into town, and you learn more about this ring and the mysteries, and then the ring wraiths, and, they go out and they meet Strider, and just being more focused to start, I think helps ground the reader and helps the pacing out, and was something that I think my book really needed. Um, and so that was a major thing, was that, rather than Act 1 being kind of split between Chorus and Dagdar, you're just in Dagdar. And in fact, you're almost entirely in Greyhall, which is its capital, and primarily following the Greys. And beyond that, yeah, I mean, like I said, I cut a whole subplot that I'd kind of stuck in there. I'd had long-term plans for the character. The character's still in the book, but has a completely different. She's much more kind of in the background. It's about. I mean, I'll say this: it's not a spoiler. Nemain Wood had a huge subplot that completely changed. That is completely excised from the book, that is now actually informing a short story I'm writing for our anthology, our page turning anthology. I'm twisting it, putting it 200 years in the past, and things are a little different. It's now about this. I mean, this isn't a spoiler. It's just the premise. It's now about a knight, kind of a pseudo like Arthurian knight, set in the pseudo Arthurian period of my world, around this famed hero queen of knights, Atlanta the Great, and it's about one of her knights who contracts sort of my world's equivalent of leprosy, and that's all I'll say. But in this draft, before AP got his hands on it, Nemain contracted my bark rot, is what it's called. I think it may not even be mentioned in this draft now, but it's a basically fantasy leprosy, and there's more going on there, but that was kind of the basic premise there. And it was just so disconnected ultimately, and the main, in a big way, it was kind of just setting stuff up for her later on. And it was just not a POV we necessarily needed. But what happened then was I realized I lost a lot of my insight into Tristan Wood as a character, who, from the very first draft, I felt like I understood him and felt like he was really complex. But he started out being he didn't have enough screen time, really. And he needed to be better developed and to understand his motivations and his worldview more. So, um, you know, that led to the prologue being written as it was. That actually came before the main subplot was cut out. But after that, then I was like, okay, I also need to give Tristan POV chapters. He, in every draft up until the last one, only had the prologue as his POV, and I was like, I really think he needs this. And that he got to then, you know, you got to understand him better, I think, and understand his point of view. And I think it helped elevate the emotional nuance and the tragedy of it, without getting into too many details.
Hmm.
Can I ask a question? Somewhat starting a new topic, but or related-ish, because you talked about how much you learned from the editorial process. I have two questions. Did you engage any other types of editors to publish your book? And secondly, the you mentioned that you are training to become a screenwriter, are a screenwriter already,
I,
but
I've been paid to do some work. I'm not in the Writers Guild yet, but I say pursuing because I'm not like an established screenwriter. I've done all my like quote unquote training in terms of like I went to school and
mm-hmm.
things like that. But like I'm always improving, or trying to at least. And but I've been working as like an assistant in the industry primarily, and a reader and different odd jobs. Yeah.
Got it. So my question was whether what you learned for screenwriting informed or changed how you wrote your book in any way. What you brought to the writing process from there.
Yeah, great question. So the first part I believe was, did I get any other editors? My sister, I actually was paid to do a copy edit. Um, I think that was on an earlier draft though, so I think the final draft I did all the copy edits. It had been pretty thoroughly copy edited, but I have found typos that drive me nuts. Some of which I've gone in and fixed since then. But otherwise, no, I just paid for developmental edits with AP, which I felt were more necessary. And yeah, those initial line edits with my sister. And then other than that, I mean, I have a writers group of screenwriters actually, who read my book. They read it in the messiest way possible, which is as I was writing it. And so things were constantly changing. And they were real troopers, and they're some of my best friends. But they gave great notes that helped shape the book and helped me kind of find a lot of the characters and make some key decisions about a lot of things. So in that way, my screenwriting very directly informed it, because I was for a long time, all my notes I was getting was from screenwriters, who definitely have a different sort of training. It's weird to comment on it that way, but I do think that probably impacted the way the book was coming out. The other way in which it was impacted was when I started the book, I was deep in film school, and I was sick of what I was being taught. I was sick of this very strict Hollywood 3-act structure. Um, Everything had to be a certain way. I didn't want to write that. I was like, novels can be more adventurous. I don't have to like fit into this standard. So I'm just going to write a book and I'm going to wing it and see what happens. And I'll worry about the structure later, which again, it took me years to find the structure of the book. And so in that way, I was very distinctly fighting against my training, you could say. I was like, if you wanted to say, I like had like, I was getting trained in like classical music. And so I was like going out of my way to try to learn how to play jazz. And there were a lot of hiccups in that. It was exciting, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about prose. I learned a lot about. I'd written prose before then. That was what I cut my teeth on before. Um, I wrote fan fiction before I got into screenwriting, and so that was kind of where a lot of my writing training was before then. Um, so yeah, in that distinct way, my screenwriting absolutely impacted it. Beyond that, I think it also just I I don't know that I'm like the world's best dialogue writer, but I do think that I have an ear for dialogue that a lot of prose writers don't, because screenwriting is so much dialogue, and that's where I've spent so much of my time like honing my skills. And so that's something um, that I am always trying to be conscious of, and I do think comes out on the page.
Thanks. So, did you always know you were going to do both screenwriting and write a book, or did the book thing just happen on the whim that you mentioned? No.
Um. Oh. Uh. I. I mean, I started out not even thinking of screenwriting as like an option. Like that would just for whatever reason didn't even like when I was a kid. Like that just wasn't on my radar. I thought maybe of directors, but not screenwriters when I thought of filmmaking. And then I decided I wanted to go to film school. I wanted to learn how to screenwrite. I read a book and like wrote my first screenplay while I was in high school. And I actually went when I went to film school. I decided like part of the reason why was because I saw everything very cinematically. I'm a very visual minded person. Like I know not everyone is like this. Human brains work differently, but I like picture things very clearly in my head. And stories, I very much am like I'm viewing the shots, I'm viewing the characters' faces, like I'm viewing the big spectacle, the scenery, all of that. Um, and so that I felt like lend itself to screenwriting, particularly because I was really tired of having to describe everything, maybe uh, paradoxically. And then I got to writing a bunch of screenplays, and I missed describing everything. And I missed the freedom you have to be more poetic with your words, which you're actively discouraged to do with screenplays. They want it to be more kind of to the point. Like it's good to have a voice, but you're not going to spend a long time waxing poetic about, architecture or like, a rose petal or something, right? Like that's just not how it works. Um, so I realized while I was in film school, basically, that I wanted to write a lot of different things in a lot of different mediums. I'm like my goal on my like dream bucket list is to write like, you know, I would like to write a play someday. I have written short plays in the past. I was a theater kid in high school. I would like to, write a musical, whether it's a movie musical, probably not because those don't make any money. And so no one makes them really, or, a stage like off Broadway sort of thing. I have these books in me and more books in me that I would like to write. I have lots and lots of uh, movie like feature screenplays and television shows in my bones, written, that people in Hollywood have read. So yeah, I don't know that I would say I always wanted to do both, but I pretty quickly in film school realized that I wasn't going to be satisfied limited in one medium.
Cool. And do you have like plans for what Truth of Crowns musical and movie and things like that? Or like as in, do you think about things like that when you write about how this would fit in different media, or do you simply write for what, the novel and then yeah.
I would be lying if I said I didn't. I absolutely do. I started briefly a television pilot of a much, much earlier draft of this book um, that I never finished. I I don't even know how it would be adaptable, particularly with things that are going to happen in later books. But it's possible, I guess. Um, I would love that. I mean, that's where the money is. I'm not gonna lie. There's a mercenary side of me, but two, I think it's everyone's sort of. I understand there's some authors who are like very precious with their work and they don't want to see it, despoiled on screen or on the stage or something. I think I am much more understanding about, because I work in the industry, kind of the costs and the give and take. And, you know, like, for example, I'm someone who's, I wax apologetic about the Wheel of Time show a lot. Like, I'm a fan of it. I think it's, you know, as an adaptation, I think its merits are debatable, because it does veer so far from the source material. At the same time, I think it's really, like, particularly season 2 is really good TV. Maybe not like absolute peak, TV, but like enjoyable for me to watch. Not that I'm without my criticisms, but just, that's how I feel. Um, and so I'm not as bothered by like the changes and things like that. I just kind of expect them, and understand them. And so I think I would be okay with my works being changed in an adaptation. Yeah. I don't even remember what was the original question. Just like, do I think about this? Yeah, I definitely think about it, and I don't let it stop me from writing things the way I feel like the story needs to be told. Like, I'm number one concerned with this working as a novel series, and as an individual book, right? Like, I want Truth of Crowns to read well enough on its own that, like, obviously there are lingering threads at the end. Like, it's not a complete standalone work, but I do want it to feel like you have completed an arc, right? Like, there you have reached an ending, and I think it does that. In the same way that, if you were to make a season of television, I would hope you make it so that even if the story continues past it, season 1 ends in a way that you're like, okay, they've completed this arc, they've completed this storyline.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess some things are hinted at that it's fine if it doesn't continue in another story. Like, you can, I think the reader can sort of fill in the gaps themselves a little bit if the story doesn't continue. I do think it is pretty complete in that sense. Um, Steve, did you want to ask another question, or otherwise I have some more?
Go ahead.
I got a list working my way down.
Okay.
So I guess one question that I really love to ask authors, not that I've been in many interviews, but when interviewers do ask authors, is what kind of research you had to do for your book. Just did you base anything in real life, and did you deliberately do research, or as you came upon things that you wanted to fill out, you wanted some real life inspiration and then you went and did the research there? So yeah, I'm just very generally interested in the things that authors sort of pick up on to write their work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I did a lot of research. I think history inspired my story. I haven't mentioned that yet, but history inspired my story as much as if any um, fantasy book or play. I mean, it's not historical fiction. There aren't cultures that map one to one onto real world ones. That was very intentional, as I kind of wanted to mix, um, you know, what we would view racially, linguistically, culturally, signifiers. I wanted to kind of, like, I really like how in Malazan in Wheel of Time, there is that kind of melting pot, you could say, and that everything is a little more mixed up. It's a little more alien to what we expect. But that said, I did a lot of historical research into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. For this first book, primarily focusing on um, Italy, the history of, like, Rome and Venice and Florence, and medieval England and Ireland and Scotland and Wales and France. I would say those are kind of the places I really went to. The Crusades, that was another big thing. For a long time, I thought book 2 was going to be inspired, a big part of it, by the Crusades, and I decided that didn't make sense for where the story was going. And so I made it all the backstory, the history of the world. So you have a number of holy wars that are referenced in the book that do match on to the real life crusades to some degree, not perfectly, but they like one of the things that I sort of like to kind of give a very specific example of the flip flopping. That's not a spoiler. Um, Outremer is this term for the kind of crusader lands, the crusader states established after the First Crusade by the Christians who came and conquered um, areas around the Holy Land. And I sort of flipped to what seems like the more Muslim side of things, had their crusader states essentially in my world. And so in the kingdoms of Ordai and Beor, which are you meet characters from, they're in their past, in their not so recent past, or not so ancient past, rather. They had been partially occupied essentially as part of a series of holy wars, and they had these small kingdoms and principalities and counties pop up, just because I thought mixing that around was interesting, and changing kind of the tides of history in interesting ways like that, so that it's not so clearly one to one. And yeah, I mean, I did a lot of religious research. Nothing. None of my religions map one to one onto anything. Again, very intentionally, because I don't want someone to read something and be like, "This is what I'm saying about XYZ belief system." Um, I would be writing a religious treatise or something if I was going to do that, right? Like, I think I have things to say about like the nature of faith, and the nature of organized religion and things like that, but not about a particular real world faith. But that said, you want to ground your story, and I think the best way to ground your story is to bring in real world elements. So obviously, the faith of Trinitos, which is kind of the primary faith you see in this first book, is based in large part on Catholicism and medieval Christianity, particularly Western medieval Christianity. Um, and so, similarly, like how knights worked and tourneys and all that, that's something that AP brought up actually. Was I, in the tourney that happens in my book, I did not have it that people were essentially having to ransom their horses or their armor or whatever after they lost. And this was a thing I knew, but had totally forgotten about. That, like, when two knights jousted, whoever beat the other one, they got their plate, they got their horse, they got that. And the guy who lost would have to pay for it if he wanted it back. Or if he wanted, if he just wanted to keep it, he would just pay the victor. And so, yeah, I tried to ground it in as much history as I could while still making it its own thing. And yeah, lots of reading real like history books, and just online research, scouring the interwebs, um, understanding how armor works to the best of my ability, but also not letting research get in the way of the writing or telling a good story too.
I was really curious about jousting because there's a lot of detail, and in that scene specifically, that I was impressed because it was obvious that you put a lot of time and effort into that scene.
Thank you. I really appreciate hearing that, because that's one of my favorite sequences in the book, and it is something I put a lot of research into. It's a thing I love. I mean, even when it's less historically accurate in something like the Knight's Tale movie, if you guys have seen or heard of, which I love, it's just such a fun, wonderful movie. I just love jousting. I go to the Renaissance Fair. I'm going to go to the Renaissance Fair here in Southern California next month probably, and they do jousts there, and I love it. And they admittedly don't knock each other off their horses. They're a little safer than that in this day and age. But it's a sport, and I like, but it's the medieval sport, right? And I like the way you get that competition. You get, the rivalries and the tension, and it's a way to like kind of, it's war writ small, in the way that I kind of feel all competitive sports are. And so it's something that I just find very interesting, and I was like, absolutely, I had to include it in the book in some capacity.
And the action scenes, did you I don't know, do you have any experience with martial arts, or did you also get that from research as well?
Oh man, some research definitely. A lot of it, honestly, is kind of just like feeling it out, like
Mm.
in the most literal sense, like writing to make it visceral, and like it's just down to like the emotion. Like writing action scenes. Um, it's like writing any other scene in that you want to write it in the way that'll make it the most emotional, that it'll hit the points the way you want to hit them. And so often that means, leaning into slightly more chaotic prose, maybe more staccato prose to like keep everything very clipped, very fast paced,
Mm.
keep the reader going. You want it to be very visceral. So really, highlighting um, the costs, people getting injured. My book is one where like it's very rare that someone is going to leave a fight and not be, like limping, or if not more seriously wounded. People get concussions if they fall and hit their head. That happens in this book, because that's something that I think it's a silly trope in like movies and books, that like people will fall off a horse and be totally fine. And it's like, no, like you're probably concussed and you're gonna have to deal with that. I'm the son of two doctors, so this is a thing I think about. And I just think it adds a little more gravitas to the action scenes, right? Where you are afraid, like, oh, someone could get seriously injured here. You could lose a limb, or you could break a leg, and or if you get cut, it could get infected and you could die, or have to have it removed. And yeah, so in the quality of the writing, it's I mean, it's not. I'm not like cool enough. I know there's an up and coming author who I think started self pubbed and it's now trad pubbed. Alexander Darwin, I think his name is. I think he wrote the Combat Codes. Who is a martial artist, and he like teaches classes. And I think that's so cool. I haven't read his book yet. I am very curious to hear, kind of see how his experiences translate into the page. That's not me though. I'm entirely just like, I think this is emotionally resonant and powerful and intense, and like that's what I'm aiming for. It's all about emotion, really.
Nice. Yeah, I did enjoy those actions. They felt very chaotic as well, which I guess what
Very
you
much
were
intense.
going for. Yeah, yeah. Uh, New question. Steve, feel free to jump in whenever I don't wish to hog the conversation, although I do sometimes do that. But the epigraphs, I think those are one of my favorite storytelling devices. I love just the existence of epigraphs in a book. I think for me adds a lot of depth to the world, like all this history, and sometimes it gives us information about what happens after the books too, right? Or what's coming later on. Like you said, you basically tell us that some some of the characters are going to die in the first epigraph. So I guess, and I think the other interesting thing about them is that you have to write them as if you're a different author. So I was
Right.
curious how you structured your epigraphs. Um, how did you come up with the list of, say, books that you would quote from, and who your characters would be, who do these, who wrote these books, for instance?
That is a great question. I'm so glad you asked about epigraphs, because I also love epigraphs. Anytime I open a book and there aren't epigraphs, I'm disappointed. And I think my original inspiration for that had to probably be Dune. I mean, I'd read other books with epigraphs, I'm sure, but I just loved the way that Dune's epigraphs told a story, what they added to the story, for the world building and the characters and the thematic depth. Malazan is good for that too. Prince of Nothing, obviously, we've been reading. I love the epigraphs in that trilogy. Um, in terms of like figuring out what the epigraphs are, they're one of the last things I do. Generally, sometimes I'll get an inspiration for something and I'll throw it in as I'm writing. Like I have a couple for book two right now, and I'm like really deep into book two. But the vast majority of chapters at this point don't have an epigraph written. That's something that after I kind of have the whole book, I can like look in and like, as I'm massaging each chapter and like figuring out, okay, this is what this chapter is about, this is what this chapter is about, what's the best epigraph for that, right? Like, Is it going to be something that reveals, you know, a thematic tie, or is it going to be something that is, maybe even a little more blunt and like is like giving you additional perspective on a character, and who they are, or at least from a historical point of view. Is it going to be something that gives you an idea of like the religious beliefs, which often again tie into kind of the thematics, and I think flesh out the characters too, because they give you a sense of sort of what they're grappling with, in the world they live in. And in terms of the authors, a lot of it is just kind of making shit up, to be honest. Like, particularly like the historians, like I just like write a name that sounds cool, and sometimes it doesn't sound cool, and I'll go back and change it. And sometimes it doesn't sound cool, and I don't change it. And then I publish a book and I go, oh, I wish I changed that name. I hate that name. And it's just a process of like, you do want each one to feel unique. Like I have a number of historians in this book that are referenced. And as I'm going through it, I start to realize like, oh, this is the point of view of this historian. This is what they're writing from, because you do want to, as you said, Barsha, you want to write in the perspective of a different author, right? Like they're going to have their own perspective, and history is a story. It isn't written completely unbiased. It's just not. Some histories are more biased than others, certainly. Some are propaganda, and some are, just biased in the way that like you naturally bring your cultural perspective and whatever evidence you have in front of you to it. Like I have one of the history books that's referenced a number of times is The One True History of Dagdar. And I think that name itself kind of gives you an idea of the historian's intent and perspective, right? And so I wanted to play with that, right, and be very aware of that. It's definitely something I think about. And as for how it actually like plays out, with an individual epigraph, it varies so much. But that is its own process, definitely. I mean, I can tell you, I wrote a lot of epigraphs kind of just like flatly through, and some of them I like kind of just like picked which chapter they're going to go with. I was like, this one seems like it goes here. Like I knew I needed like this particular bit of information, so I needed to find a place to put it, so I put it there. Other times it is more kind of deft and sort of, again, like thematically appropriate. So it varies a lot, but it's definitely something I think a lot about.
Nice. And on a somewhat related subject, the first epigraph that you said basically tells us that a major character is going to die. Um, how do you, when you reveal something like that, I think there is also, maybe for me, the worry that your readers may not get attached to the character who's going to die. So, did you have to think about that and figure out how to balance it so that there is some level of attachment, or that the readers do tend to should care about the character when their inevitable death does come?
Um, oh man, I have a really complicated answer for this one potentially. Some of it would involve spoilers, so I'm going to avoid that aspect. But
Or we can, I guess we've talked
oh,
spoiler free
well,
enough. Maybe we can jump
we can, I
in.
can avoid at least to start this, and I
Okay,
don't know
yeah.
if Steve has any other non-spoilery
Oh, yeah.
questions, but I went into this. I mean, that wasn't even something that occurred to me at first. Like I could see how that would be an issue, but like if it's good enough for Shakespeare, I felt like I was like, it's good enough for me. Like I don't think that telling someone this is going to happen, is going to ruin the experience. I think of Dune, too, where it's not that you learn of a character. Well, you do learn of a character's death, in epigraphs, but also you learn, of the ultimate fate of the character in terms of the role he inhabits, the main character, Paul. And I didn't think that weakened him as a character. I think the bottom line is the epigraph is not the whole story. And oftentimes the epigraph is giving you a very particular perspective on the story rather than it being the story itself. Like what you're reading is what happened, right? This isn't some uber postmodern, like Malazan is, without giving spoilers, you can debate because it is written by a character in world. like the book series is written by a character in world, you can debate what's real and what's not. And like I've seen some people speculate that some of the characters aren't even real, but are like an amalgamation of characters and things like that. That's not the case here. Like what you're reading is like what happened. It is the story. And so I felt like, you know, if they're either going to like the character or they're not. I wasn't that worried about them getting attached. If anything, I was like, that's on me. Like I need to worry about that. And that character, there were drafts where he was less likable. And actually that was something that AP helped me with, where he just came across as kind of a buffoon for too long. And I made him too incompetent. And so one of the changes I made was to make him more badass, just like very bluntly. I was like, I need him to really be a kick-ass warrior, because that was my original vision of him, was as this great, like kind of heroic character, but who has a tragic flaw and is, thrust into a situation that he is just not prepared for. Um, and yeah, and I felt like over the course of the story, people would just, if I do my job right as a writer, they will care and they will mourn for his death, and they will mourn also because of the people he leaves behind, who have to grapple then with his death. I think it's not just the reader losing someone, right? It's the characters in the story losing someone. And so that was something that I trusted, if I did my job appropriately. And it took me many drafts, I think, to get there. It would be impactful.
I guess semi non-spoilery, but before we get into spoilers, how to like heavy spoilers. So I guess we've established that you aren't shy about killing off characters.
No.
Is that hard for you to not kill them off? Is it because it's hard as readers to get attached and then they're gone?
Sometimes it is. Like for the big death in this story, the death of, we'll get there. Uh, that wasn't hard. Writing the scene in some ways was hard because I really wanted to like feel it. Um, and it's one of the scenes I'm most proud of, actually. I think it's very raw. I think I wrote the first draft drunk too, which helped. Uh, that's a secret sometimes. You know, little something to loosen you up will sometimes make the emotion a little more raw. Anyway, that's an anecdote. I It was really hard with the character who is the very last to die in the book, because I felt like there was so much more story to be told with him, and I loved him. He was one of my favorite characters to write, for a lot of different reasons, and so it's the missed opportunities, I guess, that is what's hard for me. But I felt like the story, he was in such a position that he should not get out of it. And the story was stronger for it, particularly being something that is very explicitly a tragedy in the classical style. Um, I get attached and I do get sad, and I'm writing book two and I'll be like, God, I wish I had this character, like whether it's to solve a plot problem or just because like I miss that perspective, I miss that voice. I balance this a little bit by just making new characters that I like, and that I hope the readers like. I think thankfully in epic fantasy there's always room. You don't want to like bloat the story too much. And certainly I think I'm guilty of having some red shirts, who are there and maybe look cool, and maybe I'll do something to give an allusion to an interesting backstory, but like they're there to die, right? That definitely is the case. But the bottom line is I just like stories where characters die, and I like that you feel that risk that anyone could die. And if not anyone, then almost anyone. I mean, again, like this goes before even Game of Thrones. Well, Game of Thrones is an obvious reference point, but or Malazan, is another one. But I was a big Joss Whedon fan growing up, and he, is famous for killing a lot of beloved characters. I loved Harry Potter, and Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling would kill. Obviously she did not kill the big three. This was still a kid's story ultimately, but she was not afraid to kill off like beloved side characters, and I think that really had a huge impact on me from a young age. And I'm someone who is very, I think a lot about death, for a lot of reasons, including stuff that is in the book, based on my own lived experiences. Um, and I was not a young person who felt like I was immortal. I was a young person who very much was aware of my mortality and thought about it a lot. And so I think that comes out in my story too, where thematically death interests me, and in line with that, I like it where if you're telling a war story, people are going to die, and that's just how it is.
So one more before we get into spoilers. I just have to know, do you have a drink of choice when you want to get loose and kind of like let it fly?
Uh, I mean, it varies. It's whatever's around, I guess. I'm generally someone who drinks either. I would say one of three things. I'm a big cider guy. Ciders are like my number one drink of choice if I have the option. Otherwise, and like just like a classic apple cider, I like a dry apple cider. I like a sweeter apple cider too, but just cider's big fan. Um, White Claws. I am definitely that like, young 26-year-old who like loves White Claws, Um, if I go to a party, I'm bringing a thing of White Claws. Like that's definitely a go-to. And then otherwise wine, white wine in
Hmm.
particular, or rosé, are drinks I'm particularly fond of. I try to avoid liquors just because um, I consume liquid like pretty fast. Like not like even always intentionally. I just like some of it is like, you know, I think I have a genetic predisposition for alcoholism, to be a little real here. It runs in my family, and I'm thankfully not one. I do not rely on alcohol to function, um, but I like drinking. But another part is just that, like, I literally like it's like a source of comfort to just like even just water. I'm always when I'm on these podcasts and stuff like have something to drink, and because I choke really easily, and so when I'm
Hmm.
eating food, I can't just eat food without a drink. I have to have something, so I'm always putting something back.
Nice.
I had to look up White Claw because I had it confused with Bear Claw, and I was like, I thought we are talking about drink.
Bear claws are good too, though.
Can't confirm they are delicious. Yeah. So are we ready to get into spoilers?
Yes,
I'm down if you
please.
want.
Okay. So everyone, if you have not read the book, we're about to spoil everything. So you've been warned. So, okay. So go ahead, Varsha, if you want to kick it off.
Oh, I might need a minute to think of my. I wrote down my non-spoiler question,
Oh,
so we're prepared. But I'll pull up the other keep notes. But
Here, as a bridge for all this, unless Steve, you have something immediately, I'll just say that the epigraph, kind of to pull back to like a lot of the Shakespeare references and things. I literally, it is so close to the one of like the opening passages of Romeo and Juliet that when
mhm.
AP read it, he was like, "Is this too on the nose?" Like he was like, and I was like, I don't think enough people know Romeo and Juliet to be bothered by it. I think it's going to be okay. Like the two households, both born of ancient glory, is like almost word for word how like part of how Romeo and Juliet opens. It has a whole line about like star-crossed lovers and things like that, destined to die. But I took that and I was like, I just want to like tip my hat, hang the lantern on it, being like, this is the story, right? And Yogan is going to die. Now, I have been surprised to find that a lot of people read that and uh, didn't necessarily take that to mean he's going to die in this book. Is some of the
Yeah.
reaction I've gotten is they were
yeah,
like, oh, he's going to die, but not in this book. And that wasn't even a thing that had occurred to me. So that was, I guess, I got the shock factor anyway. I did want his death to be shocking too. I wanted he doesn't go out in the way heroes usually go out, right?
Hmm.
Which was very intentional.
So Loria is one of those characters, and this is something that doesn't happen too often, but Loria is a character that I loved, and then I I loved and despised her at the same time because but she's a person, and all the characters are people. They do good things and bad things, but you understand why. But Loria goes through a lot in this book.
She is my favorite. She's the character I'm proudest of in terms of her arc, because I do think it's the most tortured. It's the most, in some ways, dramatic, the most morally complex, and I think it's also a very real uh, issue she grapples with. This sort of the sense of loyalty she feels, and her as someone who's very abused, having these like really complicated feelings and doing things she doesn't want to do, ruining relationships, and ultimately, doing committing murder, because of uh, her complex family life, you could say. And yeah, it's something I have big plans for Loria. I can tell you, I was actually writing Loria before we came in. Loria in Kansu. I don't think it's a spoiler. That's where she's headed at the end of the book. And I'm very excited to get into more of her story. And I'm glad what your reaction, Steve, is that's one of the consistent reactions I've heard is, a lot of people start out really liking her, and then by the end of the book hate her, and that doesn't surprise me. Um, I will always be soft on her. Although I have to be soft on all my characters to some degree, especially the ones I'm like writing in their heads. Um, but yeah, I'm glad that worked for you, because that's again the storyline I think I'm proudest of, and how just absolute she's just a mess. She's just so broken, um, and tortured, and you know I also felt one last thing I'll say is there are aspects to Loria's storyline, both in this book and then in the series as a whole, that I felt like I didn't see enough female characters being given these types of arcs. And so I wanted to write a woman who had a story, a type of story, and some of it you haven't seen yet, and it will play out in future books, but that I feel is almost always reserved for male characters. And I wanted to tell a very, yeah, that's where I'll leave that. I think she's very special to me, and definitely very important in this series.
Is the Saint Queen who adopts her also addressing some similar gap, perhaps? Because, I mean, yeah, she was another very interesting character for me to read because if I remember correctly, when we're introduced to her, she adopts this child who's lying on the side of the road, and you're like, "Oh, that's so nice of her. She's bringing the kid up." And then you're in Loria's perspective, and apparently she's been ill-treating the heck out of her. So has the princess to a great extent. Like they have this love-hate relationship, and Loria's like this really abused and traumatized child. Poor thing. I felt a lot for her, and yeah, I don't remember reading many abusive female characters like that. I mean, was it also filling a similar gap in your mind, or did she just happen
Yeah,
for other reasons?
I mean, I think she definitely falls into the Mad Queen trope, um, and that is something that I was very conscious of. I wanted her to be, yeah. I mean, I think in fantasy in particular, women have been slotted into very particular roles a lot of the time, and so I'm definitely interested in exploring. Um, Yeah, exactly. Like you said, often when it is an abusive parent, I mean, not that Josere is any better, but he's also the more passive one in that relationship, right? And the Saint Queen, she is, you know, uh, she's in charge and she's the primary abuser. She's kind of the toxic heart of that family, and so that was definitely something that I wanted to explore. Was that like, showing the ways in which um, that sort of power, and those positions can breed monsters out of women too, and not just monsters in terms of a tyrant, which he absolutely is, but as a mother, I mean, you see in the detailed ways of like as when Loria was a little girl and when she was just a cute little baby, right, cute little toddler, the Saint Queen adored her, was so sweet to her, gave her lots of gifts, remembered her, not her birthday, but her name day. And then as she grew older, as she started to hit puberty and stopped being this cute little thing and, maybe was moodier, suddenly she wasn't treated so well anymore. And she wasn't a doll anymore. She wasn't a pet. She was this person. And that's when the abuse got really bad. And, you see similarly that she has favorites and she plays favorites, right? And I think, yeah, I wanted to explore kind of the nuances of that. Often really like fucked up nuances, but the nuances of that sort of family dynamic.
And I also thought she was a very interesting parallel to Mir, right? Mir? How do you say his name?
Yeah,
Okay. Uh, yeah, as in, I guess they both have magic and they're trying to hide it and they're both afraid of it to a certain extent. So I love the pairing of those two characters together. I almost expected that they'll have a romantic arc, but that got shredded to bits, which was nice. Like it was unexpected. I liked where that went.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think no question, just general appreciation, I guess, for those two
I
characters.
I appreciate you appreciating that and commenting on that because everything you said was very intentional. And I will say that their stories very much play out in parallel. They are a character that exists. There's a duality to them that I'm intentionally exploring, and that continues going forward.
Nice, nice. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I was also appreciative of the non-romance there. That yeah, but on the topic of romance, there's some scenes of Yogan and Lanny that, well, you're killing me, Carl. The end of let me see what it's on page 279, but the end of chapter 11, or sorry, end of chapter 19. Um, the as a way of farewell, she kissed him. That would have to be enough. He knew it would never be enough. Killing me, Carl. You're killing me.
I'm glad. That was also, yeah, a scene I was really um, fond of, and their dynamic was one that I was eager to explore. I think she is someone who I suspect Lanny probably gets a bad rap. I think she is like understandably like she is not a perfect character, but I think she's someone we get a very limited point of view of her. So she's someone who I am actually I feel a bit protective of. But her and Yogan's romance is definitely it's also tragic, right? Like, because it's ultimately one that doesn't work out, and I wanted to tell a romance of that nature, right? Um, something that like the political realities by necessity, make that sort of thing, if not difficult, impossible, or if not impossible, then difficult rather. Um, and so, yeah, I thought that was, just ripe for tragedy, because in many ways, the whole book is about how these systems of power, these politics, how they ruin the personal, and how that interplay of personal and political is just a recipe for disaster.
I'm skipping way ahead to almost the end of the book, but another thing that I really appreciated was um, well, the interrogation scenes, the breaking of Yogan through that. Like he he was this really strong character, but then he's breaking under whatever pressure they're putting on him through the interrogation process, and then the questioning of the truth that comes out of that. I really liked how you explored that, and I think you did that with multiple characters. If I remember correctly, there was another character also who was interrogated similarly, um, and
Jasmine
there,
under the
and
shade.
yeah, and their information couldn't be trusted. So you had to. Sorry, I got the noise, but yeah. So there was this. Yeah, I really appreciated that thread as well, and how, and I guess that added a great deal of tragedy to Eogan. Like it wasn't losing in a battle or losing in a sword fight or whatever that killed Eogan. It was just this not exactly mundane, but in a way that anybody else could die, even though he's a prince. He died in a way that anybody else could die. I thought that
Right.
that was really interesting, and yeah, that was another. Yeah, I guess I'm just interjecting with things I like rather than asking
I
questions.
appreciate it. I mean, you're talking about. I love hearing this because, well, the things you're talking about are a lot of the things that I was um, very conscious of. Truth, the nature of truth and lies and secrets, a huge part of this book. I mean, it's called. This book has had so many titles, and one of the reasons I settled on Truth of Crowns was because it immediately, beyond that being something that is actually like quoted in the book, that the quote Aaron has early on came before the title. Um, it highlights that we're going to be talking about like the nature of crowns and monarchies, and also the nature of truth, right? We're going to be talking about truth and lies, therefore, right? And I think that's really important because I think it is a quite potentially nuanced subject that often gets flattened a lot when people talk about it. I think as adults, you're like, oh yeah, we know. Like sometimes you tell a white lie, especially to like a kid or something, but like I think there's the question of truth and like what even is true, is an interesting one. And yeah, Yogan getting broken down is very sad. Yeah, that's definitely something that that was tough. That was tough because he was this very proud figure, and it essentially all happens like he puts himself in a position where he gets caught essentially, but he's doing it out of like I think a goodness inside him, and pain. A lot of things go into his decision making, particularly in the back half of the book. But yeah, and then that he's just killed in a dark room, right? His throat's just slit. I wanted to really dig in with the like trial by combat of it all, like that he calls for that, and I was like, that's the kind of like the extra knife in the gut or the salt in the wound, right? That you're like maybe for a breath think that he's going to get something more dignified, and no, it's just a quiet little death in a dark room.
Yeah, that was very different, and yeah, that I did really like reading that sequence. That's another place where the word enjoy doesn't suffice or is
That's
wrong.
fair. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
But sorry, Steve, go
Oh,
ahead.
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna switch tracks to go back to the beginning. So, did you have more Eogan questions or?
No, just more tragedy. But go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, Mir was another really interesting character for me. I think if I had to pick a favorite, maybe he would be the one. Although Loria is pretty close, but I have a few questions about him. One, I think I wrote this on the forum. His initial part of the story felt a lot like Bran
Definitely.
from Game of Thrones, and I mean, I liked how. I mean, he was a sick child, but other than that, I what I really liked was their joy for life that I felt a little bit in Bran, and I think I felt that in Mir as well. But then he quickly became somewhat cynical, and I think after the bad thing that happened to him, and I don't know, he started swearing a lot. I think he felt more grown up at points than Eogan did. So yeah, I guess just generally, how did you design that character? And I think you also mentioned a Harry Potter influence there. So would you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, Mir's an interesting one because he definitely is the character that I think takes the most from me. Like some of his health issues are ones that I have lived with and that I wanted to give to a fantasy character. And in some ways, that's the inciting incident, right? Is his birth, and that he, 100 years ago, I was born with my esophagus connected to my lungs, not my stomach. And 100 years ago, you would have just been dead. Like the surgery didn't exist. I mean, it was rare up until like it was invented like around World War II. And so you think in like a fantasy setting, you know, well, what's the solution? Naturally, magic, right? A wizard did it. But that has consequences, right? Or I wanted there to be consequences, and then that had to inform the character, right? So he is frail, and he is much more aware of his mortality than Yogan is, right? Yogan is very much, he has a verb for life that, like, Mir's still a kid, particularly at the start of the story. You know, he still goes on stupid adventures, and I think that was always a thread I was trying to balance. And I'm not sure, you know, I think that's up to the individual reader to tell me, you know, how they think I did. Um, if he feels his age or not. I think he is someone who has to grow up really fast. I do think he is very smart, and very self-aware in a way that most kids his age are not, because of things he's gone through in his life. But he still has blind spots, and he still has a lot to learn, and a lot to grow. And I do think he's someone who is neurotic and insecure. You see, you know, I think very quickly you kind of see that he feels very insecure, and he looks up to Yogan and kind of wishes he was Yogan. Um, of course, not knowing just how, you know, flawed and sad Yogan is too, you know, in his own way. But yeah, he's more reflective, I would say, than Yogan is, which is, I think, where that sense of maturity comes from, right? And even with the world weariness, is that he thinks a lot. He lives a very internal life, and that comes out in the way he views the world, the way he views himself. And so then, as soon as everything falls apart, it's suddenly like it, it's almost like, oh, I knew this was what it was. You know, I knew the world was bad, and it's actually even worse than I imagined. And he lashes, or not lashes out, but he does lash out, but he latches onto that, and it becomes this sort of defining feature. He's definitely someone who holds on to, like, I think you could define him as someone who struggles with depression and anxiety and mental illness, and that when he undergoes these traumatic experiences, I mean, he's a teenager too, right? So it has a huge impact and fundamentally changes his worldview. So that he, you know, you see later in the story, and certainly going into book two, is paranoid and no longer trusts people, and thinks, you know, the only one who can like care for, you know, me and my family and the people I love are us, our inner circle. And on top of that, then he finds out, well, that's not even entirely true, because he finds out his sister has been keeping secrets from him, and that she's playing games that have huge consequences, for their family. And so, you know, he is a very cynical character, definitely. And I think that's something that you will see him grapple with over the course of the story moving forward, is, you know, being a boy forced to act a man way before he's ready to, and how that scars him. And can he overcome these scars, or is he just going to fall worse and worse? And I don't think the trajectory one way or another is going to be a straight line. There is going to be some zigzagging going along, and him struggling to figure out who he is, especially now also that he has these memories, inside him as of the end of the book, which is not, again, credit to AP. That was an AP Canavan idea. That was not a thing before I worked with AP. The memories of the previous immortality bearers, that was all AP, and I just loved it. He brought it up, and I was like, that's cool. That's super cool, and ties in with other plans I had for Mir. And it's been fun to play with in book two. And it's central in book two, I would say.
Nice. I really love the serpent possession of me. It's like, I'm gonna destroy the world. And some of it is also me, isn't it? Like, some most of it is the serpent, but some of it is like, yeah, I'm gonna give vent to my anger.
Absolutely, it is. It's that very distinctly what happened there was me pulling from, my experience with shonen anime, and specifically, I mean, it's like a trope of like the teenage character getting like this insane power up, and then but it like leaves them out of control, and they're just like Hulk smash, you know. Like I specifically, I think of like Naruto, which I grew up reading and watching, and he has this demon fox inside him that will like sometimes come out, and that's 100% where that idea came from. And I thought it was an interesting thing because kind of in a very literal way, it's a Deus ex machina. Like he's
Mm.
effectively taken over by a god who is way more powerful than him or anyone he's going up against, and so he just wrecks shit. And I wanted to take that and to take this idea of like this Deus ex machina and make it like again a tragic thing that you're like, oh no, this is actually a bad thing, you know. And in fact, this could be really bad, you know. Like Mir could completely lose himself and never come back from it. And going forward, there's always the risk now of like, oh shit, the serpent's there waiting for an opening.
So cool. That last scene, the scene with just like burn everything down. Um, to get back to tragedy, the interlude with the tale of Kelpie and Honeydew.
Yeah, I'm glad that worked. I That was one I knew I needed a meta tragedy on top of
Mm.
the tragic romance you see play out in the story. I knew I wanted something that was like much more literally Romeo and Juliet, which that story kind of is. Um, yeah, cool. I'm glad you enjoyed that. That was something I also enjoyed interjecting.
I have a question. Sorry, I took time to unmute, but sorry, Steve, are you going to ask something? Okay. Uh, but jumping off of that, some of the interludes that you had, they felt a lot like, I mean, I couldn't, there wasn't a lot that was familiar about them. I have, maybe I don't have enough like mythology background to map them to anything I know, but they had this certain character to them, like they were fairy tales or like mythical tales. So, was that influenced by your knowledge of mythology and fairy tales? And were there any familiar elements that I just don't know about, or did you build brand new stories?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. That's exactly what they were trying to evoke. The kind of idea of the ancient mythology. And, I'm a big myth buff. I grew up reading Greek and Norse myths in particular. And as I've gotten older, I've delved into other mythologies. Celtic mythology definitely informed this book a lot. Native American mythology, um, different ones. That's a very broad statement. There are a lot of every tribe has their own mythology, every civilization. Aztec mythology definitely impacted a lot of the feathered serpent imagery in some of my approach there. Um, but yeah, with Kelpie and Honeydew, I mean, it was trying to evoke a sense of a fairy tale at the same time that Romeo and Juliet, and then adding kind of the epic fantasy flavor, a little, making it even maybe a little more twisted in some sense. That it's like it's the guy's father who's like going to marry her, which actually is kind of a fairy tale thing. Now that I am saying it, um, with Jonas, it's interesting because he is very real. He is a historical figure, but he is also surrounded by mythology. And so, the account you read is very important to the story. Um, I think even as a book one, you can see the connections, right? Like Mir is descended from Jonas, um, and that it was Jonas's actions that made that connection with the serpent and Mir and everything. Things echoing. It has thematic purpose there, right? Of kind of the book, at least partially, is about kind of the sins of our forefathers coming back and how they harm us presently today. Um, but beyond that, yeah, I mean, Jonas as a character, there's a lot. There's so much mythological. Like I wasn't directly being like I'm retelling this story, but twisted. Um, I Jonas's story was one of the earliest things I wrote. It like literally was um, I think while Loria was still two characters, she was in the like first half of the first draft, two different characters that I eventually was like, they're too similar. They need to be combined into one, and they will be richer for that. Um, Literally, the myth of Jonas. I mean, I've changed details, but like the gem swords, the 4-in-1 armor, raising the continents, the drowning, everything there. That was some of the earliest stuff I came up with, and I think I just like gravitated towards it very strongly because it did feel to me like a real myth. Like it has that kind of sense. It plays off of kind of um, motifs you see in the real world, whether it is like a great flood, right, which influences a lot of religious beliefs, a lot of mythologies throughout the world, particularly um, around where the Abrahamic faiths sprouted, and like um, in the Middle East, and in like Eastern Europe. And um, as for Jonas, he was very much the kind of classic. I wanted him to be like the classic mythological hero figure. So he has, Achilles in him. He has Hercules in him, Cuchulainn. He's someone who has this like great strength. He has this mixed, almost divine heritage. He, does great acts. He kills huge monsters, or at least defeats them, right? Um, and I think I don't think it's a spoiler to say that there's a lot more to his story, and a lot more to him as a character. And what I can say is he also has historical influences of there are figures in history who have turned into myths, like Julius Caesar, like Genghis Khan, like Alexander the Great. Um, I think the common through line there, right, is these conquerors and the way that they become semi-divine, if not outright divine figures to cultures around the world, and how that story covers up the atrocities they committed and kind of the monsters that they were, even as human as they were, um, in doing their great acts. And so that was something at the center of it all too. And I'm sorry, I've been kind of taking a winding path to answer your question here. Um, Specific mythology, yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned a lot of the big ones, right? Like the myth of the flood. Hercules was a huge one. Again, like Genghis Khan was really in my mind when I was thinking of Jonas, and that we haven't even really fully touched on. It's only sort of brushed over of this big war he fought, basically, right? Um, there's a lot going on there. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. I did enjoy the interludes quite a bit. They were some of my favorite sections.
And they matter. I will tell you, they have an impact on things.
Nice.
I was just going through my tabs because you know how I love tabs. One of my favorite scenes was on 537 when the Saint Queen is asking for Igonel to confess, and he has the really act of defiance. You are a monster born to a privilege you do not deserve. That whole sequence was really powerful.
I'm so glad. I love hearing. What's fun too is, I mean, anytime hearing any compliment, obviously, that's lovely, and I appreciate it. You write in obscurity and hope for your work to be appreciated in any regard. But like that scene didn't exist until the last draft, so there was only ever one version of that scene, and I knew I needed it. It was part of Yogin's building up his character, where I was like, I need to give Yogin a moment, a really cathartic moment to kind of just be like, fuck all of you, like to just let it all out. In the same way, 100%, like I'm very open about it being inspired by Tyrion Lannister has kind of a similar scene in A Song of Ice and Fire. And I just thought it was great, this opportunity in a trial to just unload and to highlight, kind of the emotional conflict that the character has been going through, and like how they feel about it, and kind of highlight their growth and how they've changed, how their perspective has changed. So I'm glad that worked for you, because I think it is sort of the last silver lining, before he dies. It's his last little moment of defiance, as you said.
And the Saint Queen and Loria, when when the Saint Queen tells her, "You will be my hero," and she asks, Is that why you took me in?" Some heartbreaking stuff again. Just what a tortured character.
Yeah. I'm pulling up my highlights, and there's some really nice quotes here.
Oh, I have plenty of quotes.
What? Yeah.
I love all the Steve quotes.
Grief was a dangerous thing, a madness that came in fits and starts and seduced one into, I don't know how to say that word, macabre fascination.
Macabre. Yeah, it's French.
Okay. I am trying to remember where this is from.
Uh, that's probably
The Saint Queen ordered Loria to scout the walls. Yeah,
yeah. Is that from Loria's perspective,
I
or
think so.
yeah? Because talking about it's talking about the Saint Queen in the wake of her daughter's death, right?
Mm. Oh, yeah,
Um,
yeah. That's what it
and
is.
yeah, how she is unraveling.
Mm-hmm. I also like this one from one of the epigraphs. Truth is a weapon. Thrash wildly with it, and you will bleed the human heart dry. Refrain entirely, and you leave yourself open to domination. But if you wield truth's uncertain edge wisely, you will master a man. And isn't that what a certain character that we're reading about is doing?
Yep, most definitely. It's the truth. Exactly, it's a powerful thing. That's one of
Yeah.
my favorite epigraphs. I yeah.
On page 49, the easiest way to become a monster is to believe you are one.
Mm, I have that highlighted too.
Let's see, page 114. I just really like the way this was described. The void-like depths came alive with a rush of a current and sound Mir could not name.
Writing all of those like dreamy. See, I love dream sequences. Even when they're like more explicitly memories or prophetic or something. I'm a sucker. I know not all readers like them, but I love them, and dreams will continue to be an important part of the story.
Yeah, I think those were some of my favorite bits of the story too. I like dream sequences. I enjoy a good dream sequence, and I think this book had some nice ones.
Thank
Um,
you.
chapter
Well,
42. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
no, go ahead, Varsha.
Oh, the epigraph again. The purpose of tragedy is not to instill pity and fear in the audience, but through completing actions of a certain magnitude and depth to purge them of these emotions. In other words, the purpose of tragedy is catharsis.
And this is again being very open about inspirations. I all but ripped off a quote from Aristotle where he talks about essentially the purpose of tragedy is catharsis, and I rejiggered it, but I basically wanted to lampshade everyone to be like, here, like this story is a tragedy, and here's the point of it, right? And so I literally took his whole like theory of tragedy, and kind of brought it in. You have, Herodon is my sort of like ancient philosopher character who I get to throw like fun, clever quotes into his mouth.
I think all the epigraphs I've highlighted are by Herodon. I don't remember.
There you
Oh, the
go.
truth one is okay. It was
That's,
Atlanta the Great.
yeah.
Okay, not Herodon. But I have another one, and then I'll let you go, Steve. Sorry. Home is transient, like the seasons. It might be a place or a person, but it is not eternal. Acceptance of this is a mark of adulthood.
Yeah, it's on my list too.
That's it. Yeah, that's also one of my favorites. It's things like that are ones that I just speak to my lived experience. Like that quote about home is definitely something that as I grew up, felt to be very true.
I didn't read it's on chapter 14. Civilization is but another name for hope, and in
Mm,
hope lie our greatest fears and failures.
Also one
nice.
of my faves. Yeah.
Then on chapter 20, I wrote, "What are you doing to me?" Chapter 19. Let's see. Just the sequence of Lanny, and again, you're killing me on chapter 20 again.
What what's chapter 20? What happens there? I'm blanking. What are you doing to me? Is that, oh, that's when
Yeah,
her tongue gets cut. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Or 20. Oh no, no, wait. That's, are you talking about when she gets her tongue cut?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That was something. It was rough. A little nod to AP. The fact that she slurs her words for a while, I hadn't even considered. And in hindsight, I was like, that like she would have to relearn how to speak. You know,
Yeah.
when her tongue gets cut, I didn't have that in most drafts, and so in the final draft, I was like, well, nope, she's going to slur her words for a while because she is. So all credit to AP Canavan for that. Again, you asked earlier, what do you get from an editor like AP? Stuff like that, like brilliant things, details, and larger things that you
Mm.
just, you have a blind spot, and he, elevates it, brings brilliant ideas to the table.
Nice. I
Nice.
got one more.
Yeah, go for
Uh,
it.
I think this is when Mir tries to throw the monster off. Damn it, I lost it. Where is it? I mean, basically, he says, "My life is a miracle and mine alone to live." I may be misquoting that because I don't have it in front of me, but I really liked
I
that.
think that's the quote. Yeah.
And I like that immediately after that. Usually, that's a rousing speech to to prevent a thing from happening, but then no prevention here,
No, he
full
gets possessed.
possession.
Yeah. There definitely are a lot of things like that where I'm very consciously like playing with tropes that you've seen in like stories, and I'm like, I want you to be like, no, this isn't that. Like, you know, it's like the concussion thing, right? Like Ignatia falls from her horse and gets a concussion. Like, yeah, Mir, you think he's having this rousing moment where he's gonna like expel the serpent. Nope, he's possessed. He's just not strong enough to do it. Like things like that, I think are fun. I always appreciate when a story like subverts your expectations in that way, where you're like, oh,
Mm.
I know this trope, and then it's like, no, sorry, it's worse than that.
Yeah, so I know no pressure, of course, but when how is book two coming along? When about what do you have a timetable? About a year or two?
Oh, I mean, I definitely think I will have it out in 2025 is what I would say. I want to say the first half of 2025 it should be out. I think just it's a lot longer. It's going to be a lot longer than I expected. I have 145,000 words written. Um, it's coming along. I'm a lot farther in some storylines than others. Loria's is one I'm actually still struggling with.
Hmm.
I know where it ends, and I have the first like 2.5 chapters of hers written, and I like them a lot actually. But I'm not an outliner, and so there's a lot of this stuff I kind of figure out as I go. Um, I'm also being careful. The story is growing. The scope expands in the sequel as I feel it should, but I want to not fall into the problem that a lot of epic fantasies do, where it gets bloated, or maybe there are too many POV characters, or you could say like the Feast for Crows problem, where suddenly you're introduced to characters you've never known before, and they have a ton of POV chapters, and I love I love George Martin, I love A Song of Ice and Fire, and I could hope to be a fraction as successful as he is, but I'm trying to keep it under control. But there still is an expansion to the story, as we get deeper into it. So hopefully in like a year is what I would say.
We're eagerly awaiting the the second book. Yeah.
Nice. I'm excited to hear it, and I think I'm also excited for. I mean, this is not like me telling you to go and like reread right now, but I did write this book to be reread, like Malazan. Like I think the Prince of Nothing trilogy. I think A Song of Ice and Fire. A lot of my favorite books. There are a lot of subtleties and foreshadowing and things like that you just can't get on a first read, and so I'm excited to hear someday. Maybe it's a call to action to a listener or something. But because there's a lot, I think people will be surprised about how much is laid out in the opening pages for what happens in this book, but also the whole series.
Hmm.
And is it going to be a trilogy, or do you have it planned for longer than that?
2 arcs is the plan currently. So 6 books, kind of 2 arcs of 3 books.
Nice.
Do you know how it ends?
I do. I do know how it ends. I mean, there are certain characters that I don't know what their fate will be, but I know who in my head are the main characters and what happens to them. And I have the final. I don't know if I have the final scene in mind, but I have scenes very near the final scene in mind. The final climax, you could say. I know what happens.
Have you told anyone else?
No. No.
Do you want to? I don't want to know, but do you want to? Is there like this desire to just tell someone? Do you ever feel like you just want to?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I have it written down. I do have it stored. I said I don't outline, but I do write ideas down and things like that. And I remain open to it changing. But certain things like the absolute ending, like you would not be able to predict it. Like even with what you have here, I mentioned like there is very explicit foreshadowing that once you get to the point, and if you reread, you'll be like, oh, I see what was going on here. Like there's a line in this book that is like in game. Like it's like this is what is happening here, but you just don't have the context to be able to figure out what that means yet. So certain things will not change because I have made it so that they can't, because I have already written them into the story, is what I will say.
Interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah. Well, Carl, thanks for hanging out with us and dealing with my scratchy voice.
No, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
So, for anyone looking to connect with you and buy the book, where is the best place to find you and or the book?
So the book you can buy just all throughout the internet. Like if you want to buy it from Barnes and Noble, you can get it through Barnes and Noble. If you want to buy it through Amazon, that's where most people get books. You can buy it there. But it's the print is distributed widely. The ebook is only on Amazon. There's not yet an audiobook, sadly. That is just I do not yet have the funds. I may do a Kickstarter someday. I don't know. I'll figure that out. But as for me, you can find me on social media like Twitter and Reddit, or Instagram even, at Carl D. Albert, I believe is my handle generally. And then I would prefer if you just find me on page chewing, because I'm around a lot and it's quieter and there's less yelling. So
I don't know. Varsha does a lot of yelling there. I'm not sure.
that's true.
It's my favorite thing to do, mostly when I use blackjack hands.
Yeah. Yeah, that too. And Varsha, where can people find you other than the blackjack table?
No, just there. That's where I live now. No, I'm kidding. You can find me on my YouTube channel, Reading by the Rainy Mountain, and the podcast Speculative Speculations, and the other one, Bright Threads in the Tapestry, which is currently on a bit of a hiatus, but I will record more episodes for soon.
Hell yeah.
Nice. Yeah. And you can find me on page chewing and any of the links down below in the podcast description or on Varsha's channel.
Yes.
So thanks, everyone. We'll talk very soon.
Bye.